Our next speaker in the Sustainability Webinar Series, and it's really a pleasure to introduce to you Abby Reyes, who's a graduate of Stanford University, a law degree from Berkeley. She is currently a sustainability researcher here at the Environment Institute at UCI, and has had a really fascinating career. And she's going to talk to you about the legal perspective on sustainability, but in doing so, she's going to talk about her own story and her own experiences in what has been, in many ways, a tremendously moving and challenging set of activities. So I think that you're in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Abby Reyes.
Thanks for the introduction. Before I begin, I have a little advertisement. I'm also the mentor for a few of the student research groups in this class. One of the groups is looking into sustainability curriculum here at UCI, figuring out if we've got it, if we've got enough of it, if we could have more, what would it look like? They've put together a survey. Nora emailed you the survey a couple days ago. Please fill it out. It would help the research group. It would also help UCI, as UCI is in the process of figuring out what formal education programs to offer in sustainability going forward. So ideally, do it by tomorrow. Don't do it during my lecture. If you can't get to it by tomorrow, that's fine. Still keep it on your list and get it done as soon as you can. So I want you also to participate with me in an experiment tonight. I'm going to be talking about the law, but I'm not going to approach it from a formal legalistic approach. I'm going to be introducing the material through stories. They're personal stories. They're personal because I was there. They're personal also because my hunch is that as you listen, you may deepen your own process of discernment about what role you have to play in shaping sustainability law going forward, regardless of your chosen career. So the experiment is that I want to invite you to consider listening with a different quality of attention. I want you to use your analytic mind, of course, but I also want you to use what I'll call your species mind. That part of you that knows that the planet is in peril and that you have a role to play in turning things around. What might you hear in my talk that you would otherwise miss? Don't miss it. I'm going to invite you to close your computers. I'll give you the slides. If your computers remain open, I will trust that you're using it to take notes. So the main point that I want to make tonight is that we don't have here in the United States, and as you heard from the Admiral a few minutes ago, it's kind of just emerging here and there around the world. We don't have a national, federal approach to sustainability law. It just plain doesn't exist yet. And I want to put forward the idea that it doesn't exist because reforming the law in the current system of the industrial growth society does not quite allow for the development of a sustainability law or an approach to a comprehensive approach to sustainability through the law. To develop that would require the development of a new legal system based on the development of a new system and culture of a life-sustaining society. To get there, just working within the current system from within the current system, we won't necessarily have the tools, the language, the relationships, the frame of mind we will need to figure out the new system of law that we need. That act requires divergent thinking. That is not necessarily what we do when we work to improve the current system. But I want to put forward tonight that it doesn't mean we're starting from scratch in figuring out how to create alternatives. There are plenty of communities around the world, mostly indigenous or native, here in North America and all over the tropics, who are standing up to put forward a vision of sustainability or a legal approach to sustainability based on their own communities' legal and ethical codes, which more closely align with the concept of sustainability we've been talking about in this class than do the national laws that affect use and development of their lands. The voice of these indigenous communities, about whom I'm going to speak, is often muted or impaired or cut short because these are communities that are also still fighting for their lives. What I mean by that is that these are communities that are still reeling from the adverse effects of the mining, oil, and gas operations we have put mostly on indigenous land. We'll talk more about that tonight, but I just want to start out with that main message. So, Professor Matthew has explained that in international efforts to rebuild societies after war or natural disaster, it's only in the most recent years that the United Nations has really embraced this idea of bringing sustainability in as a framework in the rebuilding process. And similarly, in the United States, in domestic law and policy, the effort of incorporating sustainability into any given area of regulation is nascent and piecemeal at best. As I've said, there's no single piece of federal legislation setting our nation's approach to sustainability. In a different political context, even a slightly different political context, there could be, but we're not there yet. So, examining how the law grapples with sustainability requires us to look in these unexpected places. The first part of this lecture is going to look briefly at the United States, at the federal framework, and with the limitations I've described, moving to the local and regional efforts that the Admiral mentioned several times in his talk a few minutes ago. And then the bulk of our time is going to be spent looking more closely in these unexpected places. So let's start with the United States. It's going to be really brief overview and simplified. While there's no federal framework, there are, of course, scores of environmental and land use laws that set out to regulate how people and their corporations use natural resources. In the early part of the 20th century, we used federal laws and presidential executive orders to set aside lands and to create our system of public land management. This was also the period in which we divided up the remaining, or the vast majority of our public lands for other uses like mining and forestry. In the latter part of the 20th century, as one environmental disaster after another sparked a national conversation about clean air, clean water, or safe energy, we enacted myriad federal laws in what has become our modern environmental legal regime. When you take an environmental law course, these federal laws and their state counterparts are most likely what you're going to be studying. That's not what we're going to talk about tonight so much. But still, here's an overview. Many of these laws say, look, if you're going to build your factory on this riverbank, and you're going to use the river water in your industrial production and then plan to put it back into the river, you can't do that until you've assessed what impacts the use of that water is going to have on the environment, on the economy, sometimes also on the social side. Yet these environmental laws and that environmental impact assessment system weren't fundamentally driven by the concept of sustainability as we've talked about it in this course. About the closest we come to addressing sustainability head-on is in the preamble to our National Environmental Policy Act. This was an important act. It established that system of environmental assessment that I just talked about. And this is what we've got as far as sustainability law goes. The preamble to this law, which means this is not the part of the law that's saying, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. This is the reasoning that the congressmen, for the most part, gave for why they were implementing this national policy. It was to declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere and stimulate the health and welfare of man, and to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation. This law was a big deal, but it was only a matter of time before extractive industries learned to use other parts of the legal system to weaken the effectiveness of this federal approach. So many in the sustainability conversation in the United States are unsatisfied with that limited federal framework. Advocates have proposed other innovative approaches more directly addressing sustainability's triple bottom line, like green-collar jobs. During the 2008 presidential campaign, both candidates, Obama and McCain, took on the banner of green jobs. President Bush himself, late in his term, signed the Green Jobs Act of 2007. Yet, like so many other issues that shouldn't really be considered political, green jobs and the sustainability that it represented was swept off the table during the healthcare debate. The Green Jobs Act represented the possibility that the federal government was going to take the lead in creating major public works to retrofit and rebuild the public infrastructure in our country, to lower radically our carbon footprint. It would have been our best shot, I think, at a national legislative approach to sustainability. But politics, as I said, got in the way, and subsequently, there have been calls from members of Congress to do even more, like to get rid of the Environmental Protection Agency or repeal the Clean Air Act. In this political climate, there's very little room for other legislative action based on a vision of sustainability. So the sustainability conversation is temporarily shut down at the federal legislative level. Where else is it happening in the United States? It's happening, as the Admiral has found as he's toured the United States, at the local level. It's happening in neighborhoods like here in Irvine or Laguna or Aliso Viejo in the creation of transition towns. It's happening at the level of the city governments making sustainable development strategic plans like Oakland's Energy and Climate Action Plan or the one that Irvine's developing too. Or in the state legislatures creating green jobs policies as they have now in Washington, Texas, Massachusetts, and New Mexico. Since I have time, do you guys want to see a video excerpt about green jobs? I think it relates enough to some of the questions that students had for the Admiral that I'm going to just say it's worth your time.
We got a lot of problems. Crime rate is high. Not enough jobs.
The highest vacancy rates in the country, the second most housing stock in the
I was
country.
paid $600 a month to $800
Highest
a
rate
month.
of African American male unemployment in
The
the
bills
country.
are so high that people can't keep a hold out of their
I
home.
like jobs, you got a family to take care of. People are willing to just about do anything just to make ends meet.
For us, going green isn't just a lifestyle, it's about survival.
The fastest way to stop the bullet is to give someone a job. And what better job to give them than the one that transforms where they live?
That transformation of an economy that's suffering to a green economy that creates access to quality jobs for neighbors who need it the most is some of the most important work in this country. When we talk about a green economy, no place is pushing us more clearly forward in the right direction than Buffalo.
Well, our green development zone is meant to sort of begin tackling some of those challenges around green construction and rehabilitation, the sustainable landscaping in our vacant lots, to do some food production as well as just sort of beautification, and then ultimately, big vacant lot management. We are banking land in this neighborhood. We've got 20 plus lots, and for us, the game is about control of the space. We're putting people in places to actually control the development of this neighborhood.
People have a difficult time getting to healthy, fresh, affordable food. And so everything we do is really about localizing the food system, teaching sustainable growing methods to our teens and the youth who are going to be the future leaders, and community development.
The community garden, it's allowing me to grow this good, healthy food at a fraction of the cost. Not only that healthy foods are a shortage. When you do find healthy food, it's so expensive that a lot of us low-income families cannot afford it. So we have corn, tomatoes, strawberries, carrots, and the list goes on and on.
When you don't have a lot of money because you're paying bills, your bills are so high, you can't afford to have someone come in and insulate your home like Push did for us. My neighbors are paying $300 to $800 a month. They look at me and say, I wish I could have my bill like that. It's insulated, it's energy efficient. It's great because you're giving people an opportunity to get out there and work.
Training young men and women from the neighborhood in green construction skills, which we see to be a kind of a key component of the green development zone. And we learned about solar power, geothermal, how to insulate your house, how to make it net zero. And when I got out of high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And like, school's not for everybody. And these green jobs can help people like me that like to work with their hands.
Before I got the AmeriCorps job, my friend, passed away, and I think that that was my sign to actually get a job, so I could be laying with him right now. And I get to drive down Winter, that I live a couple blocks down, and see something that I'm actually building and creating with my own eyes.
And I think about it every day. I think about it, and I say, Lord, thank you for pushing me and keeping me on my feet.
This pilot program could help us, model ways to deal with the big ticket problems of the city and hopefully become, a model for other places just like it.
The real opportunity lies in the possibility to scale these things up and to put large numbers of people to work and to train up large numbers of people to weatherize large numbers of homes. And that's the kind of investment that we need from banks, the kind of investment that we need from public institutions, from government, to kind of bring our neighborhoods back to what they once were.
Okay. Oops, don't look at that yet. Not yet. Well, we can just go there. I'm just going to first drive home the point to make the question even easier for you to answer. That some of these initiatives, like we've seen, are the product of the creative use of already existing federal legislation, like using the Community Reinvestment Act this way for green jobs. Others are the result of the creation of new legislation at the state level, and others are initiated through, the programs of community organizations. In lieu of national policy, sustainability conversations are showing up in local and state laws. So here's your first I concur. True or false? In the United States, most legal developments in sustainability are happening at the state and local levels rather than the federal. Oh God, if any of you gets this wrong. Okay. It's happening mostly, maybe that's an optimistic group that wants to say that it should be happening at the national level. Indeed it should. The statement is true. So, but there's also another important sustainability conversation happening here in the United States and across many parts of the developing world that is, to varying degrees, making it into legal form. It's the conversation I mentioned at the beginning of class among indigenous communities and their allies. The green jobs, transition town, kind of green economy conversation is happening in urban America. In rural North America and in many parts of the developing world, the conversation is not about the green economy, although many of these communities can't wait to get there. The conversation is still about grappling with the harms that the carbon economy has brought to their lands and communities. What do I mean by this? Where do we mine our coal? In the western United States. In large part, it's out in Indian country. Where do we get our oil? Insignificant, perhaps not dominant part, it's in far-flung corners of the world, again, often out from under the indigenous land. Where do we get our natural gas, our uranium, our other energy resources? Time and time again, these come from native land. And time again, these communities have not fared well in the bargain. This is a really important point. And I want you to understand what it has to do with sustainability law. As we'll see from the stories I will share, the communities I've worked with have indeed much to say about sustainability law. Their communities are often organized around legal and ethical norms, as I said at the beginning, that more closely resemble the emerging concept of sustainability than do the federal laws that actually govern the use of their lands. Yet their ability to stand in leadership to inform any national legislative process in sustainability has often been hampered by the fact that they are still working to figure out how to get their communities back on track after development of mining oil and gas. It's hard to chime in, let alone lead development of sustainability laws when you're in that position. So we'll spend the rest of the evening looking at some of the ways some of these indigenous communities are nonetheless using law both to redress environmental and human rights abuses and also to forward a sustainability agenda. In November of last year, I had the opportunity to help facilitate a historic gathering. It was an advocacy training for non-native lawyers here in the United States who had committed to volunteering their legal services with Native North American communities facing environmental justice, environmental health, and sacred lands, sacred sites protection issues. Of the 20 or so Native communities represented at the training, many communities had brought stories of environmental damage resulting from years of extractive industry on their sovereign lands. What do I mean by extractive industry? Do you all get what I mean by extractive industry already? Maybe I don't have to go through the examples. Okay. So at this advocacy training, we heard from one of the non-native lawyers who works with the Western Shoshone Nation in Nevada. Among other struggles, after a 30-year effort, the Shoshone and their allies have convinced our federal government that storing nuclear waste from America's nuclear power plants inside a deep hole in Yucca Mountain, across which a geological fault runs, is not a good idea. At our advocacy training, the Shoshone lawyer shared the following teaching about sustainability law as taught to her by the Shoshone grandmothers who led the campaign for Yucca Mountain. The Dan sisters empowered their lawyers to use whatever legal tools they could to protect Yucca Mountain. But in determining their legal strategy, the Dan sisters required their lawyers to remember this fundamental formula. No matter what the federal or state laws said, the Shoshone community respected what they called the laws underlying the laws. The laws of the land, the laws of the air, the laws of the water, the laws of the sun or spirit. Their lawyers had the challenge of integrating this formula into their legal approach. Can you imagine that challenge? Their lawyers end up serving as translators or knowledge brokers between two fundamentally different views of sustainability law. Their clients are basically saying, we know there's a federal approach, use it. But in seeking to protect Yucca Mountain, we're answering to a higher, or if you want to think of it, a deeper order. And we expect the legal actions to be in accord with our way of thinking about sustainability. To the Shoshone Nation, the federal legal doctrines of discovery, trusteeship, or the Indian federal law that's built around these doctrines has served as a layer of cement over the law underlying the laws. But as the Shoshone and many other Native communities see it, cement doesn't hold, right? It doesn't hold forever. This is a professor at Wisconsin, Al Gibbons. Contrary to the common culturally ingrained misreading of history, the disappearance of Native peoples and the degradation of the natural world is not the result of some abstract and inevitable development process. Both of these can be traced to a particular and identifiable source. The resource acquisition and profit-maximizing activities of some of the most powerful institutions in the industrial global economy. More satisfying, more sustainable ways of living on this planet are possible, of course. We do not have to submit or acquiesce to the multinational corporations' ongoing war of aggression against Native peoples and the natural world. We can, in fact, fight back and help give birth to more democratic and humane societies. So before I go any further, I want to work with this concept I introduced at the beginning a little bit. This is a spectrum. As we consider how sustainability conversations make their way into legal frameworks, it's helpful to think about how new systems and cultures are made generally. The gist here is that if you are serving, resisting, reforming, governing, you're still generally working within the current system and culture. You may be working to improve that system, but you're still fundamentally in the same system. When you're working in contrast to create alternatives, you are also creating the new systems and culture. This is abstract, conceptual right now. We're going to work with it for the rest of the evening, and I promise that by the end, it will help you think about this framework more fluidly. I think what we'll see tonight is that it takes people working all along this spectrum to get to the new system, say, of sustainability law. We need people creating alternatives, but we also need people working in the other parts of this spectrum, not just changing or improving the current system, but more importantly, as we'll talk about the rest of the class, figuring out how to transform that old system. Let's work with a familiar example, not from sustainability, but from another social movement, that of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement spent most of its time improving the current system. Take the example of Rosa Parks in order to work with this model. You know, Rosa Parks refused to stand up and sit at the back of the bus in 1955. When she did that, other people followed and it became the bus boycott. That was an act, of course, of resistance to the current system. The bus boycott meant that black people weren't riding the bus, but they still had to get to work. So there were other people in their communities who were driving the boycotters back and forth to town. Those drivers were serving the people resisting. It's an act of service. There are other more mundane examples of service. You know, service can be anything from feeding poor people at your church to tutoring kids. You know, is a way of trying to improve the current system. Later in the civil rights movement, you've got the passage of legislation. You know, the negotiation and passage of the Civil Rights Act, where in this area, their view of the law governing sustainability into the Columbian conversation of economic reform compromise is inherent. And eventually you have leaders of the civil rights movement running for office in order to help with governing the current system. But it's not perhaps until much later that we start to see how civil rights grew in its sophistication to start creating new systems and culture. The example I'll give is one of just a few years ago in Detroit. A few years ago in Detroit, the chain grocery stores left the city center for the suburbs. There were no more grocery stores serving the communities in the city center. Detroit's response to this crisis, which was very much framed as a civil rights issue, led to the creation of the largest network of community gardens in the country called Newtown Farm. That is an example of a community getting together to say, we are creating alternatives and building the new system, not necessarily still trying to improve the old. The Green Jobs video we just watched might be another example of the creation of the new. Green Jobs Act in federal legislature in 2007 might be an example of reforming the current system, trying to get transformation. So I'm going to go, you don't have to take this idea, but I'm going to put it out there, that your generation's movement could be considered what some people call the Great Turning. The Great Turning refers to the shift from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. Your work is going to involve not merely changing or improving the current system and creating alternatives to get us to the life-sustaining society in the area of law and all other areas, but also figuring out how to transform it. The Shoshone elders instruct their lawyers to work within the current legal system while imagining the new. I think that the trick to your success is going to be in how well you harness the strengths of the current system and culture to support the new. The training you receive in college will not be sufficient to prepare you to do this. You're going to have to go beyond what you learn here to expose yourselves to experiences in any of these areas, and particularly by putting yourself under the mentorship of people who are creating alternatives, to see what they're doing well now and where they're falling short, and to figure out how to take that to scale. Nothing that's being done at the moment is at the scale we need. We've been hearing that all quarter. So here's the second eye clicker. There's no right or wrong to this question, okay? Imagine that you're in the prime of your life, say 10 years out from now, you're in the middle of your career, or at least your career is gaining momentum. Assume, this is the assumption, assume that you've chosen to help bring about a life-sustaining society. Where along the spectrum can you imagine yourself working?
All over the spectrum.
That's awesome. We need people everywhere. Look at that. Just take that in for a minute. Oops.
Thanks, Kate. So, yeah,
Come talk to me. Come talk to me at the Environment Institute if you want to figure out your next move. That's inspiring to me. So, thank you. For the remainder of our time tonight, we're going to move now out of the United States to other parts of the world. I'm going to introduce you to the work of 3 different organizations that are working to create sustainability alternatives in the law, while also continuing to make change within the current system. We're going to the Philippines, Colombia, and Burma. As I tell their stories, listen for the ways they traverse this spectrum. The Philippines story will show you an integrated approach to improving the current system and trying to transform it. The Colombia story will provide a reality check about how high the stakes can be in attempting this approach when the political conditions are not right. And the Burma story shows how to use the power of people and the power of the law to turn those high stakes into power and how to turn the old system on its head. After I graduated from college, I wanted to go work in the Philippines, my father's homeland. I got a fellowship, that you can't see, called the Luce Fellowship from the Henry Luce Foundation, which is available to all of you post-graduation before you turn 30, to go work in Asia under the mentorship of a leader in Asia doing what I want to do in the United States, or what I wanted to do back when I graduated from college. I went to work in the province of Palawan, which is this set of islands here, for a group of lawyers at an environmental legal assistance center out in the boondocks. Palawan is beautiful. It's a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and home to many threatened and endangered species. Most of Palawan's remaining upland rainforests are still populated by indigenous communities. In 1993, Palawan became the first province in the Philippines to adopt a mandate for sustainable development. Palawan's strategic environmental plan requires that any development in the state be executed within the bounds of environmental and social sustainability as put forth in Agenda 21. This is, right after Rio. Philippines took it really seriously, at least in form. Under the plan, and under a new Filipino legal regime at the time, there was a lot of devolution of power from the federal government to the local. City councils were empowered to create land and marine use plans through a system of environmental zoning, leaving substantial core areas protected. Indigenous people under this plan can claim lands and waters hitherto considered public as their ancestral domain. Commercial logging is totally banned. The whole province is considered a mangrove forest preserve. And commercial fishers are no longer allowed to fish within 15 kilometers of the coastline in order to preserve these waters for the local fishermen. Wildlife and fish export bans aim to stop poaching of endangered species and illegal fishing. Palawan is often seen as the Philippines' last frontier because of its geographic isolation. But when I lived there, Palawan was on the brink of massive environmental and social degradation. Its isolation from the rest of the Philippines, which used to serve as a de facto protection to the island's resources, were fast becoming one of its greatest liabilities, was fast becoming. Because if you're so far out there, even if you've got a strong sustainability legal regime, if nobody's watching, you're going to do whatever you want on the land. But that's what we were finding. There's a ton of illegal and unremediated mining. This is a group of families living on a jetty, and the jetty is made of the tailings from an American mercury mine that was there in the 70s. Lots of Minamata disease on this jetty. We had a lot of illegal fishing and illegal export of aquarium fish. The reason that it's illegal is because what fishermen were doing throughout Southeast Asia and a lot in our province was using cyanide to catch the fish. So a diver would go down, spray cyanide directly into the coral, the fish would get stunned, be really easy to catch. Later they would revive. Out they go, out of this port, port if you can call it that, this dirt cow field airstrip, directly to the international market where 80% of our aquarium fish are coming from this kind of source. And of course, while the fish recover from the cyanide, the coral never does. The coral just dies. It's a one-off. And as you may know, coral takes decades to regrow. Another kind of illegal fishing that was popular when I was there was the use of dynamite. Similarly, to dynamite the coral and kill the fish that way and make them really easy to catch. These are all little ways that they're fishing that was happening on a small scale, but by multiple people There were also pretty horrendous practices of commercial fishing as well. And illegal logging, even despite the ban on it. And illegal resort development. You know, Palauan's something like 700 islands, and they're all really beautiful. And from the outside, it might look like they're not populated or used. So a lot of times we would find out about a new resort, not because it went through the environmental impact assessment process, of which we were part as a watchdog NGO, but because we saw an ad in the paper for, you know, come to this island where we've got a new resort. What? So what do you do about that? After President Marcos, who was a dictator in the Philippines for a long time, was overthrown in 1987 through the work of a lot of what they called people power, a lot of human rights lawyers, pro-democracy lawyers. They then turned their attention to environmental protection. So people like my boss, Griselda Mayo Anda, or Jerty as I may refer to her tonight, moved from the big city to these rural outposts. She started providing just basic legal service to indigenous people trying to figure out how to get their ancestral domain. And in the process, she started to articulate the connection between human rights abuses and environmental degradation. She formed ELAC in 1990 as an effort to mobilize human rights lawyers for the environment. ELAC uses that arsenal of sustainable development mandates and environmental policies to advocate for compliance. We started out doing a lot of trainings of city council members and even state officials on the new environmental laws, because although they were given the power to enforce them, they weren't often given the background or practical training on how to do that. But we spent the bulk of our time doing similar trainings with local communities or people's organizations, like cooperatives of fishing folk, or indigenous tribal councils, or neighborhood associations. We taught fisheries law, environmental law, international human rights. We taught about the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, which is a whole class on itself. We won't go into tonight, but it's the general concept that if development's coming to indigenous land, the community has the right of refusal, the right to say no, unless the community has given free, prior, and informed consent. This is all trainings we were doing under this grove of mangrove trees. The women often at the edges. And here we are teaching people how to do citizens arrest. So we're teaching people what to do if they heard the chainsaw in the forest and they know the environmental laws. They know that you're not supposed to be logging in the forest. We role play with people how to stay safe in approaching a person with a chainsaw in the forest, and how to talk with the person about what they're doing, and then ultimately how to confiscate and put them under citizen's arrest. This is the result of one of our community's first citizen's arrests on a logger. You can see that they confiscated the chainsaw itself and some wood. There's the stash. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that this community then gets to use that wood. They're holding it in custody for the state officials whose job it was supposed to be doing this kind of enforcement. This is another type of training we used to do on tourism development, or even the basic concept of tourism. I would go with like a globe and show people, show the communities where tourists were coming from, and introduce this concept, and introduce alternatively, if you don't, or like we would do role plays with people in this context about, what to do if somebody comes up on their boat and offers you a lot of cash to buy your beachfront. How you would go about as a community deciding whether to take that offer or not. And we talked with them about what possible community-based sustainable tourism alternatives there might be, or microenterprise development using industries that they were already doing at a small level, or like forming tour boat operators, collectives, that kind of thing. So you can see at LF, I hope, how they're working, at all of these different levels to improve the current system and culture. And then they're also working on creating alternatives, like the idea of figuring out how communities can participate in tourism that's going to come one way or another, but do it in a way that in which the benefits go to the community. That's still really small scale. So I want you to think about that. Like, how do you do that on a big scale? Everybody's trying to figure that out. So I'm going to tell a story that summarizes this point about the Philippines before I move on to Colombia. In 1994, we were giving a training. I wasn't there yet. I hadn't arrived yet. But LAC had given a training to a group of city councilors in the city of Española, one of the tiny towns on our island. And during the training, a couple of the Kagawas, or council members, took some of our lawyers aside, took them to the coastline, and showed them this massive fish pond development that was beginning to be built by a developer from Manila. Now, what's wrong with fish pond development? It's not inherently wrong or bad at all. But in Palawan, the fish pond developments happen along the coast. And in Palawan, the coast is not just those sunny beaches. The coast is more often than not mangrove forest. Mangrove forest, as you may or may not know, is an essential part of the ecosystem. It is where a lot of the aquatic life is bred. It's also the main barrier of protection against extreme weather, as you may remember from Katrina. We got rid of our mangroves, and what happened? So there's a complete mangrove preservation system in Palawan. So for a fish pond developer to try to circumvent that, he had to get pretty creative. He knew he couldn't clear the forest, so what he decided to do instead was to kill it by putting up a series of dikes that would alternately parch the forest or drown it. When the trees were dead, then he reasoned he would be able to clear it and put in his fish pond. So what did LAC do with this information? First, the LAC lawyers took it right back to the training they were in the middle of and said, hey, city council members, this is exactly the kind of environmental issue you could be approaching in using the sustainability laws we have. This is your job to be figuring out how to negotiate with this developer to make sure it's done in a way that is sustainable. And secondly, LAC then immediately filed suit against the developer and the state. I didn't advance my thoughts at all in this story. And the state agencies that were supposed to be putting these laws in place. So this is, what healthy mangrove looks like. And unhealthy. This is the mangrove in the state of dying. And this is what it looks like after a fish pond has gone in and then is drained when the fish are mature. And you can see, that here there used to be a mangrove forest. This is not from Española. This is. So when there was a stall in the legal case, LAC decided it was time for what they then called a meta-legal remedy. Meta-legal. If the laws aren't working the way they should, LAC reasoned, then you need to take direct action. That's what we call it here, is direct action. So we rounded up our volunteers, which were mostly from the local college. And when we went to Española, we were greeted by 15 Muslim youth who were representing the families of the villagers who no longer had access to the coastline for their livelihoods, along with the city councilors, went out on the dikes and conducted the meta-legal remedy, which was to destroy the 6 joints in the dikes that were critical to letting the water flow again. This was done, of course, after LAC lawyers had gone with some with federal Marines who were stationed locally, to the developer, and we read the developer his rights and reminded the developer how he could be in compliance and wasn't, and gave him one last chance to start that process. It's an important part to mention. We didn't just go out there and do it. So the fish pond stopped. And now the key to this story is that at the same time that LAC was supporting the City Council of Espanola in this case, LAC was at vicious odds with the same City Council on a proposed cement plant in their town. But because LAC had done the work to establish itself as a reliable partner, LAC couldn't be subjected to the same kind of ill treatment by the city or residents of Espanola that other organizations were receiving. LAC used that strength along with another strategy. This is the mid-90s, remember. So the internet, we had email and internet, of course, but it wasn't so much integrated into our methods of advocacy. But in this case, we were able to engage some of the investors in the cement plant who were in Canada and learned from these investors that the company had told the investors that they had gotten the consent of the indigenous people living on the land where the cement plant was going to be built. And that just wasn't true. And we told the investors that, which subsequently led to the delisting of this company from the Vancouver Stock Exchange, which itself now has gone away, whole exchange. So all those elements combined led the state Sustainable Development Council to be able to reject the cement plant, which is not to say that Palawan is free from the threat of mining generally. It's not at all. Currently, there's a big push in the Philippines to get, like the logging ban, a mining ban in the state. You can read about it more at that website, or you can look at this video, which we won't watch now. But it's a good summary. How are you guys doing? Drift? Are you with me? I can't tell at all. Are you ready for another story? I'm ready to go on to Colombia.
Yes.
Okay. So, just as I was leaving the Philippines, the Philippine government signed an agreement with Shell and Occidental Petroleum. They wanted to dig subwells for natural gas development in the shallow waters on the west coast of our island. It would have gone through as yet unsurveyed marine environments. And remember, Palawan was still a place that when I was there were teams of biologists discovering new species. It is a richly biodiverse place. And the pipeline would have crossed through the ancestral waters of several indigenous communities. This is a picture of the one consultation that Shell had with the Tagbangwa indigenous community before I left. So when I came back to California, I went right to my colleagues in Berkeley, who I knew were working with other communities in other parts of the world on similar issues. I wanted to know what they were telling communities about Shell and Oxy. We at LAC were particularly worried about Shell because it was right about this time that Shell was implicated in the mock trial, or the sham trial rather, and subsequent execution of Kansara Wiwa in Nigeria. He was a poet and a community organizer who brought to international attention Shell's practices in his Ogoni homeland. During these meetings, I met Terrence Freitas. Terry was a recent graduate from UCSC in environmental studies. He, like me, had been working since graduation with communities affected by mining oil and gas. While I was in the Philippines, Terry was working here in North America, teaching about mining law, in much the way that I described we did in the Philippines. He was also emerging as the main community liaison with a small indigenous community in northeastern Colombia called the UA. I was really interested in Terry's work with the UA. Because like the Tagbanwa in the Philippines, the Uwa were trying to figure out how to advance their own vision of sustainable community-centered development in the face of proposed oil exploration on their land by the very same companies, Shell and Oxy. Now, right in my first meeting with Terry, my first week back in the United States from having lived in the Philippines, he asked me out for a date in the middle of the meeting. I'd met him like an hour prior. We were 24. We were clearly kindred spirits in our work, and we soon found ourselves partners in that work and in love. You'll see why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you this because the personal stories matter. The tug of war over what counts as sustainability law is not between faceless governments. More often than not, it involves individuals and families on the front lines, calling for a transformation of our legal system towards sustainability, and the laws have not caught up yet. The Uwa are a community of about 6,000 people indigenous to a cloud forest in northeastern Colombia near Venezuela. Colombia is about the size of California and Texas combined. The Uwa territory, as they claim it, is about the size of half of the state of Maryland. The amount of that territory that the Colombian government recognizes as Uwa is much, much smaller, about the size of Joshua Tree. The land contains the headwaters of several major tributaries to the Arauco River, which flows toward the Amazon. And the Uwa communities have lived in this area for thousands of years by migrating between the forests and the valleys, surviving gathering, fishing, and hunting. Their agricultural practices are well known for being practically undetectable from the outside. They're known locally as the thinking people because they are the peace brokers in the region of nonviolence. They have no written language, but rather an oral tradition of song. Every summer, most Uwa people retreat up into the mountains for a period of spiritual cleansing during which they sing their entire oral history. This is a song that takes 2 weeks to sing, 24 hours a day. One singer starts, drops off, and another singer picks it up. This is how the kids learn their history. In one meeting I had, we were trying to figure out the name of a certain river on a map that wasn't labeled. And instead of turning to any book or any document, the Uwa leader I was with started into the song to try to find the name of the river. That's what I mean by an oral culture. You may have read, if you did any of the readings, you may have read that for the Uwa there's no separation between themselves and the environment. They believe that there are two worlds, one above, where they live their physical lives, and one below, a parallel world that sustains spiritual life. The two worlds balance and maintain each other. To the Uwa, the purpose of being here on the planet is to maintain that equilibrium. They consider the earth their mother, and the oil the blood of their mother. They don't want to take it out. This is some of the existing oil development on Uwa land that was also by Oxy. Some of the effects, not the worst. This is the what was then, the period that I'm talking about in the late 90s, the proposed jewel site, which happens, of course, to be in the sacred ritual area of their land. You know, it's a classic story. And this is, some of what comes along with oil development or the opening up of roads in this kind of area. As one Uwa leader tells it, oil is the blood of Mother Earth. It belongs in the ground, where it sustains the world below. Up here, it only causes violence and death. To me, that sounds an awful lot like the Shoshone explanation of the laws underlying the laws. Similar to the Shoshone, the Uwa were faced with how to insert their view of the law governing sustainability into the Colombian conversation of economic ties to the United States and is complicit in human rights abuses abroad. It too, like those henchmen, should be held liable under the Alien Tort Statute. So, are you guys still with me? going to talk about it a lot, but I can. So the gist of Doe versus Unical was putting forward to the court, in our federal courts, to say, if a corporation has ties to the United States and is complicit in human rights abuses abroad, it too, like the henchmen in the human rights cases, should be held liable under the Alien Tort Statute. The difference in the cases are whether a corporation can be brought in this way. So this is. I want you to watch this video of Earth Rights Approach because it explains more concisely what I'm saying.
Corporations often get involved in projects that lead to human rights abuses in far-off corners of the world because they think nobody's watching, because they think the victims of these abuses have no recourse.
Unical, a U.S. corporation, and Total, a French oil company, went into partnership with the Burmese military dictatorship, a pariah regime.
Actually contracted with them to provide security. Our clients were villagers who were forced to work for the Unical's pipeline, often at gunpoint.
In this David and Goliath struggle against overwhelming corporate power, litigation is the slingshot.
We are working with lawyers in Southeast Asia, in Amazon, in West Africa. We help them to bring their own cases.
We use legal tools to give people who have been victims of human rights violations the opportunity to take on corporations and win.
The idea of training community leaders in human rights and the environment grew into the Earth Rights School.
They live in our school for 9 months and then spend a month back in their home countries researching the urgent human rights and environmental problems in their communities. We're training emerging leaders from Burma, Thailand, from China and Tibet, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos.
They will be able to advocate for their rights.
We are here to ask children to be responsible for what they did.
When corporations are operating abroad, they need to know that they will be held to account.
They don't think that a community in the farthest corners of the Amazon or in the Niger Delta can obtain legal counsel and can bring them to court.
In the end, we hope that the fear is in them and that it will just become sound business sense to not be complicit in these kinds of abuses.
The movement of Earth Rights represents the light of hope. We must make this light burn brighter.
And while we never could figure out a way to seek justice for Terrence's murder without further endangering the lives of other people, there are plenty of other communities who are still pinning their hopes on their cases succeeding under the Alien Tort Statute. As you may have picked up, Unical settled on the eve of trial, on the eve of having to face the American public about the allegations of human rights abuses. Unical settled and compensated the Burmese villagers. Shell similarly settled claims that Ken Saro-Wiwa's family brought. But many other communities have filed alien tort claims that are still making their way through the courts. And after all these years, like 15, 16 years of litigating under this theory, the United States Supreme Court has yet to weigh in definitively about whether this can really go forward. But that's about to change. 2 days ago, coincidentally, one of my mentors, Paul Hoffman, a human rights and environmental lawyer, who's also adjunct faculty here at UCI Law School, argued a case before the Supreme Court. Oops. The case is called Kiobel versus Royal Dutch Petroleum, or Shell. It's another case stemming from the Nigerian cases I've talked about a little bit. In this case, the Supreme Court will be asked to decide whether corporations can be sued for their complicity in torture, crimes against humanity, and other human rights abuses. It's hard to overstate the significance of this case for human rights and environmental rights. In the absence of a strong federal legal approach, legislative approach to sustainability law, this kind of case is about the best we've got. In other words, the court is going to have to decide that if corporations can be considered people, as the court did hold a couple of years ago, if they can have the rights of people, shouldn't they also have the responsibilities too? In the federal political climate we have, where sustainability law is not advancing through legislation, the High Court is one of the strongest hopes for development of adequate protections of the communities who are at the fore of advancing alternative visions of what a law of sustainability should hold. By tomorrow afternoon, you should be able to access an audio copy of the oral arguments in Kiobel at the Supreme Court website, which is here. It looks like this. If anybody wants to get together to watch the oral argument together, I'd be happy to host a screening of it at the Environment Institute. Now, you can see how Earth Rights is, working within the current system, maybe trying to reform it. But can you also see how they're working to create alternatives? It's still, it's still not to scale, but they're out there. It's not just the legal theories, but it's also the Earth Rights schools. It's schools, much like we described in the Philippines, that I only introduced you to in Burma through the video, so I hope you caught that they're doing schools much like the trainings we did in the Philippines. It's the trainings in which communities on the front lines of the sustainability debate are cultivating their youth and their leaders who will stand up not only against the current industrial growth society, but also for the new societies and culture, the new systems and culture of a life-sustaining society. So I want us to look back in sum at the example of Rosa Parks, thinking about what Earth Rights is doing. Think about where Rosa Parks was. Now, was Rosa Parks just a fluke? Did she just on her own decide to sit at the front of the bus and not move? Did other people just randomly on their own decide to follow her? No, not at all. Rosa Parks was a member, as well as her friends, of the NAACP. The week before she sat in the bus, she had attended an extensive training at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee on nonviolent direct action. They didn't call it that then. That's essentially what it was. Highlander trained her. Social movements don't happen spontaneously. The social movement for a life-sustaining society is not going to happen spontaneously either, but with the actions of individuals, just recycling more. It's going to happen, I would posit, by the creation of alternatives, like what we've seen, the Earthright schools in Burma, or the Thai-Burma border, maybe possibly now Burma, we'll see in the new opening. And like we were doing in the Philippines, and like we found impossible to do in Colombia, or what's still going on in Tennessee through Highlander. Now, I've put forward that perhaps the Great Turning is your social movement. Along with your peers in Burma, the Philippines, the Amazon, out on the Shoshone land in Nevada, yours is going to be the task of creating the new systems and culture of sustainability and taking the alternatives to scale. It will be your job to figure out how to get to the table your indigenous counterparts, the Native youth with ample expertise in articulating what a new legal system of sustainability could be. That's not going to be easy, but it's what's in front of you, I would say. It's what's in front of us. What will this task require your generation to do? What training, what resources, relationships, experiences are you going to need to have? And more importantly, who are you going to need to be? What person are you going to need to be to do this? I encourage you to make sure that what you're getting at UCI is going to help you grow into that person. Thank you.